Hello, everybody, and welcome to South Pole's April installment of our webinar series. Today, we are going to be talking about biodiversity and the bottom line, managing risk with TNFD. A few housekeeping items here on the next slide. Mics are muted as we go in. We will be having a question box off to the side. So if you think of questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to enter them there. They get stored, and then at the very end, we'll hold a generous amount of time for questions and we can go through them together. And then also, this session is going to be recorded. So if you have colleagues or friends that couldn't make it today, don't worry, we'll send out the recording afterwards and you can share with them. Now, quickly, I want to introduce myself. My name is Chris Heisel. I am the head of advisory here at South Pole for North America. And with me today are our esteemed colleagues, Santiago Martinez, who is the global head of biodiversity business development. He holds over 20 years of experience in the industry and previously was at the Nature Conservancy. And with me as well is Diana Swindler, our senior most expert on biodiversity in North America. She sits in New York City and she has a sustainable master's of sustainable management from UPenn. Now, I'll go through the agenda briefly, and then I want to jump right into the topics. So today, we'll begin with an overview of the current state of biodiversity. These are things that I'm sure everyone knows, but it's good to set the context. Then Santiago will take us into the drivers for corporate biodiversity action. So why should companies really care about biodiversity? Why should companies act on biodiversity? Then we'll go through the TNFD as a framework for managing nature-related risks and for reporting. We'll talk about corporate biodiversity and how it fits with climate mitigation strategies. And then finally, we'll leave you with some really tangible case studies of what the leaders are doing with biodiversity today. So let's get started. And I will begin with a fact that always surprises me, no matter how many times I hear it. On the next slide here, you'll see if you add up the combined weight of all mammals on Earth, only 6% are wild. That's wild. Human beings, the population has grown dramatically over the last 100 years. It has led to mass amounts of habitat loss. And then human beings have domesticated a very small number of species to a very large degree. And it has really swayed the balance of the biodiversity that historically existed on our planet. On the next slide, you can see some of these statistics. I'm sure you're aware of them, but it's always a good reminder. Our natural ecosystems, compared to how the earliest estimates of how they existed, they've declined by 47% on average. 25% of the species today are already threatened with extinction, and the global biomass of wild animals has fallen 82% from prehistory levels. It's an unbelievable amount of change. On the next slide too, the other thing we have to remember is we're facing two crises at the same time. Climate change, as we all know, is one of the greatest challenges that humans are facing right now in the long term. And the biodiversity crisis and the climate change crisis, they are inextricably linked. So as biodiversity, habitat, and species loss continues, it is making climate change worse via the nitrogen, the carbon, and the water cycles. And similarly, as climate change gets worse, it is threatening habitats and species at an increasing rate. So this linkage is really important to both understand and to act on. So that's where I want to start today with a bit of a poll. I'm curious, and the poll might be biased because you all here are here today, but I'm curious, how many of you are currently including biodiversity topics in your climate mitigation strategies? And you've got four options. Yes, biodiversity is deeply integrated. We are beginning to integrate, sort of at the early phases. We intend to integrate, but not yet. Maybe you're still learning or gathering information. And finally, no plans to integrate for now. So Elizabeth will pull up the poll. I'll give everyone about a minute to consider. and then we can read back the results. I'll give everyone about 15 more seconds, but I'll share what I'm seeing. I'm actually quite surprised. So this is a fairly advanced group, maybe again skewed by those that are participating in the webinar today, but about 30% say yes, biodiversity is already deeply integrated in their climate mitigation strategies. About 20% are beginning to integrate biodiversity in the strategies. 45% are intending to integrate, but not yet. And so hopefully what you learned today can help you on that journey. And then the last 10% are still evaluating, so no plans to integrate for now. So I'll close the poll and I will pass it over to Santiago, who will take us through the drivers for corporates to act on biodiversity.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Today, we will begin by exploring the pivotal drivers for corporate biodiversity action, specifically knowing that it's not new for anyone here, that this action has never been more urgent, as biodiversity not only underpins what we call the environmental health, but also global economic stability and growth. Please join us in watching this following 1-minute video, which gently touches on how to address corporate biodiversity action.
You know the story of the bee? This one tiny creature was gone from our food system, and us too. It's not just bees we depend on. It's trees, it's oceans, it's everything. Everything we make and that makes our society and economy is made possible by the world's ecosystems. So when we destroy nature, we are destroying ourselves. Thanks to us humans, the world has lost almost 70% of its wildlife in the last 50 years. Our home planet's life support systems are hanging by a thread. Not only can this not go on, it needs to be reversed. But there's good news too. Regeneration is happening by governments and communities, but they can't do it alone. Every business needs to play a role. Measure your impacts, understand your dependencies, create a strategy to change how you to damage less, and fund ways to make good what is gone. Already, the world's business leaders think this way, but action needs everyone. Will you join us?
Hey, Santiago, you're on mute.
Sorry, something's wrong with the system. Okay, so I was telling you that every company directly or indirectly depends on ecosystems, and we have a staggering 55% of the global GDP that is deeply linked with nature services like clean water and pollination. And of course, as we know, as nature health declines, so as business potential. But there's always good news, of course, because there are considerable opportunities for those committed to restoring natural ecosystems to really act and start driving what we call the change. Just to give you an example, in the food and land sector alone, a recent study suggests that there's an annual business opportunity of 4.5, more or less 4.5 trillion by 2030 associated with transitions towards a nature positive economy. This includes, of course, forest restoration, sustainable aquaculture, plant-based meat, precision and regenerative agriculture, and reducing food waste. And of course, the investors are not reacting, they are reacting actually very, very quickly. Next slide, please. Over 50% of the global investors see biodiversity as a critical topic by 2030, and yet 70% lack of available say that they lack of available information as a major barrier to do investments in biodiversity. Of course, this lack of information and data underscores the urgent need for robust information to support informed investment decision, and it is urgent for us companies to provide decision makers with the right information to analyze every scenario and take a stand on how they want to move forward in terms of biodiversity action. As we all know, next slide, there are five major drivers for biodiversity loss, which include, of course, changes in land, water, and sea use, habitat loss, along with other factors as the usual suspects, such as pollution and climate change. It is imperative that most of us, or every company around the world, understands that these drivers help us to target our corporate sustainability strategies effectively. Here's where understanding the impacts and dependencies become more handy, and the concept of risks gains a little bit more importance when we think about sustainability or when we think about the future of our operations. Nature-related risks can materialize in three specific ways. One, of course, the physical and market risks. The other one is dependencies on nature, specifically for operations and supply chain. And of course, the impact on nature loss that are triggering negative consequences to ecosystems and the way the companies operate. These risks can definitely signify affections in the financial performance of the business and the continuity of every operation related to nature dependency. Because at the end, everything is connected and everything is related to each other. In this image, we want to show you how everything relates in terms of climate, in terms of ecosystem services. The transformation will change, but we want to make sure that putting in the center of our work everything related to dependencies and risks and opportunities that will give us an efficient way to design strategies where nature and business can actually thrive. These strategies need to be implemented in the short term so we can see those results in the over term and in the development of the operations of the company. We can see that nature dependency and economic impact, they play a big role when it comes to sustainability. And the distribution of nature dependency is significant. This means basically that economies, particularly those with important exposures to nature loss, they need to assess, prioritize, and invest in nature. As you can see here, we're comparing the United States with the rest of the world, and we can see that even if 54% has a low nature dependency from its economy, we can see that the medium and high dependency on economy are also representative, meaning that these sectors are actually represented by everything related to forestry, agriculture, fishery, food and beverage, heat utilities, construction, electricity, and others that we can list. As they are drivers for biodiversity loss that we have explored before, the five ones that I mentioned, they're also drivers for corporate biodiversity action. The first one, of course, is the importance of nature-based solutions and how these, for example, can mitigate up to 30% of the carbon emissions, and ending deforestation and ecosystem preservation is an urgent task in order to pursue this type of objective. Of course, the new regulations that are appearing around the world, especially for example, the Global Biodiversity Framework or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, are pushing companies towards more sustainable practices. It's also essential for corporate strategies to include these considerations to build resilience for the future and assess those impacts and dependencies to identify the risk and opportunities which they should actually pay attention and do the investments and everything related to tackle this twin crisis. This, of course, will result in effective and impactful strategies that at the end will meet something that is very, very important related to reputational risk, which is meet the customer expectations or meet our investor expectations. More and more, we're seeing that they are asking for more nature-related action in terms of how the companies are embedding nature into their operations, but also embedding nature into the balance sheet. I'm going to give now the floor to Diana, who will help us dive into how the TNFD provides a structured framework to manage specifically nature-related risks. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Santi. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to explain a little what the TNFD is. So it serves two purposes. One is a framework that helps to incorporate nature-related risk assessments into your daily operations, but also it helps as a reporting framework. So you can report also about your impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities in nature across your direct operations and value chains. If we go to the next slide, we can see why should a company adopt the TNFD framework. And there are different reasons, but one of the main reasons of why TNFD framework exists is because we need to divert the financial flows from create negative impact on biodiversity to create or starting to create positive impact. So it is backed up not only at private level, but also at national and international level by the G7 and G20 political leaders. And it is science-based. It acts in the nexus between climate and nature with metrics for assessing impacts and dependencies, and also helps to set targets to hold that biodiversity loss that we need. Also, I think one of the perks of the TNFD framework is that it does not reinvent the wheel. It just tries to integrate with other existing disclosure initiatives and standards, and it is very adapted as well to nature and international regulatory environment. As we can see in the next slide, we can explain a little more what I'm trying to say about why it has like an integrative approach with other reporting disclosures. As you see here, the TNFD has worked with a multidisciplinary network of knowledge partners that fit into the TNFD technical work. Because here what we are trying is not to add or duplicate efforts to companies to report in another framework disclosure. So here it is aligned with other reporting disclosures that companies are already reporting, like CDP, GRI, SAPS, and also helps as well to be aligned with the goals from the Convention of Biological Diversity, with the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also helps with other regulatory requirements, like for instance with EFRAG. So the EFRAG, which is the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, which is the organism behind the European Sustainability Reporting Standards that make up the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is also there is also a lot of alignment with that organization. In fact, last year in 2023, I think it was in December, they signed a collaboration agreement between the EFRAG and the TNFD, so they can keep working together into how to improve those nature-related risk assessments. If we can see in the next slide, one of those outcomes of this collaboration between the EFRAG and the TNFD is to be aligned as well with the TCFD. As you can see here, this is a closer look to the TNFD. So if you see, it has the same, keeps the same pillars for disclosure as the TCFD. You may be familiar with these four pillars: the governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And here, this is another advantage of implementing the TNFD. So it also helps companies to gather that data that is needed to report under these pillars, under these recommendations. So for that purpose, they also include the LEAP methodology, which is a methodology that basically helps companies to gather that information that is needed to report under the four pillars. So this methodology, the LEAP, it has 4 different steps: locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And you can see here, like as you gather data with this, with implementation of each of these steps, you start feeding that data, that information that you are collecting into those pillars. So here we have put an example, for instance, the information that you gather from the implementation of the locate step under the LEAP methodology will help to report under the pillar of strategy under the TNFD. And that helps the implementation of the different steps, evaluate, assess, and prepare, will also, that information that you gather from this implementation will feed into the recommendations disclosures under the 4 pillars. Also very important with the TNFD is that last year, in September 2023, they publish specific guidance of how to engage with indigenous people, local communities, and affected stakeholders. And that is a very important pillar as well of the TNFD work, is helping companies how to engage with the IPLC group. And also they release specific guidance for scenario analysis. And if you go next, please, we will see that the TNFD is gaining a lot of traction in the market. In fact, there are more than 300 companies that have already committed to report under the TNFD. As you can see, they are not companies as many will assume that belong to the agricultural value chains. Here we are speaking about every sector. We can see textile that have committed to the TNFD framework. We can see banks, cement, retail. So this is a very good variety of sectors that they see worth in implementing the TNFD. In fact, in the US, there are already 8 companies that have committed to disclose under the TNFD, but we have a broader spectrum of other companies that are interested in the TNFD. We have over 1,400 forum members representing 70 countries and 86 sectors that they are thinking about the implementation of the TNFD. And that leads us to our second poll today. So where we would like to know how well you feel prepared to adopt the TNFD framework. So we will give a couple of seconds to answer this question. I can see how the answers coming in. Okay, so here we have the results. So there is an 8% of attendance that they are already reporting under the TNFD framework, which is great. And 31% that they are getting ready, and 62% that they are not ready. And maybe we can switch the mind to those that they think they are not ready, because we are going to see here very good examples of how companies they are already embarking in this journey. Let's go then to the next part of this presentation, which is how corporate biodiversity action fits into the company's climate journey. And here the answer is clear. Please, next slide, because we have to take a more holistic, integrated approach to climate and nature in transition planning, so we can unlock those opportunities that may not have been apparent through a climate mitigation only lens. If we go to the next slide, we can see that this integrated approach is really important, as we were discussing before, because the climate and nature are completely intertwined and interconnected. So if we don't have nature into consideration, we can create negative feedback loops, but also positive feedback loops. So here we have put an example, like for instance, in the case of a company that is thinking about the construction of renewable energy assets. That will be, of course, crucial to mitigate emissions to meet net zero. But on the other side, they have to be very mindful about where those renewable energy assets are going to be implemented, because we don't want to degrade land, or we don't want to create a negative impact on biodiversity. So that will be an example of a negative feedback loop, but also it can create positive feedback loops. For instance, traditionally real estate sector has been very focused on direct operations, but now with the arrival of these methodologies and frameworks that we can assess what is happening on the value chains, a real estate company may have or may find opportunities for maximizing both nature and climate goals by protecting forest and reforestation activities along the supply chains, which will have or generate a positive feedback loop towards avoiding worst nature impacts, and also reaping the benefits from reduction of emissions. Please go next. So it is very important as well to include, I think it's a critical opportunity to include nature positive actions in transition planning, and that can be done through two different actions. One, by integrating nature into climate transition planning, and the other one by integrating nature positive objectives into transition planning. And we are going to see a couple of examples of how to implement these nature considerations into the transition planning in the next slides. So for instance, under a common climate transition plan, the goal could be like reduce carbon emissions by replacing fossil energy consumption with renewable energy. And one typical action that we can implement is deploying solar energy. In the case of integrating nature within your climate transition plan, we will be thinking about deploying solar panels, but also avoiding negative impact on biodiversity. And we can do that by implementing different actions. So here we are including a couple of obvious ones, like for instance, implementing a deforestation policy along the supply chains, or also design a plan of how the business will change its suppliers of product portfolio over time, directing or focusing only with the suppliers that can ensure that there is no biodiversity impact in the production of solar panels. So how we can start thinking about nature into transition planning? And the answer is very straightforward. Companies should start assessing nature-related impacts, dependencies, risks and opportunities across direct operations and supply chains. This assessment will enable to set appropriate targets to safeguard and restore nature during this climate transition. And this is precisely how TNFD helps companies with how we can start assessing these impacts and dependencies that can be translated into risks and opportunities in direct operations and supply chain. Please, next slide. So this is another way of thinking about including nature into climate transition planning. So in this case, what we are doing is integrating nature positive objectives. And these nature positive objectives are aligned with international and national policy. So in traditional transition planning, let's call it that way, the goal will be become net zero by 2050 by using different levers to decarbonize. And one of those levers can be reducing emissions by switching to plant-based ingredients. In the case of including nature positive objectives in your transition planning, the goal will be use natural raw materials sourced from areas with non-conversion of natural ecosystems, which is one of the main objectives and is aligned with international policies like the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also aligned with the goals of SBTN and TNFD. So how we can integrate these nature positive objectives into transition planning? So by setting short, medium and long-term objectives in line with global nature positive goals, and also using nature-based solutions which can unlock very good opportunities for climate mitigation and also for nature protection and conservation. So here we are going to go to the last poll of today. So we would like to know what is your motivation to assess impacts and dependencies across the supply chains. And as Santi mentioned before, there are different drivers for a company to add and to start assessing those impacts and dependencies. But here we will be curious about what is your main motivation. So we are going to give a couple of seconds for you to answer. So results are coming in. So we have the results. So we have that 60% want to manage supply chain risk better, 20% is per regulatory compliance, and the remaining 20% is because some stakeholders are requiring this type of assessment. And this is a good example of what we are seeing in the market. Those are very, I will say, reason-weighted reasons to start implementing a framework like TNFD, because it does help with these three different motivations. So now we are going to go into the case studies that we have prepared for today. So we have 3 case studies that we want to share with you. These companies belong to different sectors, and they are at different pace of integrating nature into their climate transition planning. So the first one of the case studies is in the next slide, which is Newmont. Newmont is a company from the extractive sector. And so the main drive for Newmont was to establish new targets for water and biodiversity that support and align with Newmont's climate targets, and explore also the opportunities brought by the nature-based solutions. So the main goal that Newmont established for this assessment was no net loss on key biodiversity value areas, which are areas of high value, high biodiversity importance. So the action that took into place Newmont was to complete a gap assessment against the SBTN, the Science-Based Targets for Nature, and the TNFD guidelines to understand better how to meet these objectives, that they are aligned as well with the Global Biodiversity Framework and global nature targets. So from this assessment, they gathered very critical information to understand what type of critical controls could implement around these key biodiversity value areas to prevent the loss of biodiversity and be able to achieve no net loss commitment. So this information, these nature-related risks information will be fully integrated into the risk management systems in 2023. So the next example we have comes from the semiconductors industry. This company is ASM, also US-based, and the main drive for ASM was to align with the Global Biodiversity Framework and best industrial practices. So its goal was to implement biodiversity protection goals of not loss of biodiversity, and also zero net deforestation through ASM direct operations and supply chains. So in this situation, they decided to start embarking into the biodiversity journey by designing a biodiversity policy that can fit into their operations while create positive impact on biodiversity. So the outcome was that ASM defined a robust biodiversity policy, establishing a reference framework for integration of biodiversity considerations into ASM global strategy and daily operations. And this policy defines the principles of conduct for the development of a business model that is sustainable and has also positive impact on nature. And the next slide, we have our last case study. It's Ocado Retail, from the retail industry, and in this case the drive was that Ocado Retail was committed to the responsible and efficient use of natural resources, with a particular emphasis on water, waste and biodiversity. So the first goal was to assess nature-related risks and opportunities across Ocado business. And because the main motivation was to include that information about biodiversity loss, included as a physical risk, into the climate risk and opportunities assessments. So the outcome is that Ocado Retail now knows more about that nature-related risk across the supply chains, and they are able to prioritize actions on priority locations that are at risk of biodiversity loss. And also it gives them a better understanding of biodiversity outcomes with different climate scenario parameters. So I'm going to give now, I'm going to hand it over to Santi.
Thank you, Dean. Now, as we are moving towards the end, I want to focus on these 4 specific takeaways that we are seeing in this slide, just to keep in mind always. First, nature and biodiversity loss represent also a corporate risk alongside with climate change. We need to consider that anything related to nature and our dependency on nature, it will hit or it will impact positively or negatively the way we engage with ecosystems or operations. The second is the importance of assessing impacts and dependencies on nature is the first step to identify risk and opportunities and embark in an effective nature strategy. The other one is the importance to follow establishing sound frameworks and methodologies. For example, the one that we're talking here about, the TNFD, Science-Based Target for Nature, Natural Capital Protocol, GRI, CDP, and others, in order to, one, understand and improve your relationship with nature, and second, be able to identify those impacts and dependencies that will help make the decisions at the end of the day. And lastly, keep in mind that forward-thinking businesses are harnessing the links between biodiversity and climate change by embedding the value of nature within their value chain and, of course, into the balance sheet. So I think this is the main takeaways that we want you to take into account, memorize them and actually apply them. And I will give also the floor to Chris so we can close the session with any questions or suggestions that you may have.
Well, thank you very much, both to Santiago and Diana. You're both a wealth of knowledge, and we really appreciate your time today to share all that you've seen and learned. Now, hopefully, is the time for the audience. So keep in mind, if you look at the top, I think, right hand of your screen, there's a little question box. Click that if you have any questions about biodiversity, whether it is on a topic you've heard today or a topic that you've been thinking about as it relates to your business and the next actions you'd like to take, feel free to ask. We are here ultimately just to try to bring you value and share what we know about biodiversity in the corporate world. So take some time now, any questions you might have, put them in there, and we have a whole 20 minutes that we can dedicate to questions. To get us started, while people are entering questions there, I have a question. Santiago, maybe for you to get us started. At a very high level, there's a few different frameworks around nature and biodiversity. There's the TNFD and there's also the SBTN. Can you tell us just quickly at a high level the similarities and differences between those two?
Absolutely. TNFD and Science-Based Target for Nature, SBTN, have their cousins in climate, which are the TCFD and Science-Based Targets Initiative. Both of those methodologies are addressing the climate part, but when we talk about nature or specific biodiversity, that's when the TNFD and Science-Based Targets come in. Both of the methodologies, they manage more or less the same information in terms that the starting point will be the impacts and dependencies. But the main difference is that when you talk about TNFD, it's only disclosure, while when you think about science-based targets, it's basically following the same steps where you locate, evaluate, and assess, but with different numbers. But at the end, what you're going to have in step 4 is an act step. In the acting step, the idea is that the company that embarks on science-based targets can actually develop or invest in a project that will answer all of the questions that you have found in steps 1, 2, and 3 that are equivalent to the locate and evaluate part of the TNFD. I don't know if I made myself clear, Chris, or do you have any more questions?
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much, Santiago. And a question for Diana. If a company has already done, they're measuring their emissions, maybe they have a science-based target. what's sort of the first step for them, a sustainability manager at one of the businesses we work with? What are the first steps when wanting to start to address biodiversity? Where do they start?
So in the case of companies that have already implemented SBTs, they have already done a lot in order to gather the right data, because they probably have data management systems in place that can help to collect the data. In the case of biodiversity, it is a little complex, because you have to find the data that is location related, right? Because biodiversity, it is specific to a location. So I will start looking into where are, first of all, the data owners, and where I'm sourcing my materials from, because that is a good start in order to understanding geographically where I can be creating a biodiversity impact.
Thank you. Then I might keep asking you. We have a question here. What are the major challenges in collecting accurate and comprehensive data on biodiversity down the supply chain? And then I'll have a follow-up for it as well.
I can take that. So there are different challenges. So the main challenge is the lack of transparency across the supply chains. So some companies, I would say many companies, don't know exactly where many of their materials come from. But there are several ways to go around that lack of information. One of them is, if you have performed a life cycle assessment of any of your products, we can use that data to model biodiversity impact. Also, it is really important to have GIS, geospatial data, so we can look at the different impacts across the supply chains. So the TNFD, how it helps is that it gives you a specific framework of how you can collect that data. So you can start reporting under the recommendations, but also helps you with that collection of data, also helps you to understand where you are probably having that relationship with nature, and where you can probably have that impact. And helps you as well to start implementing that data management system that you need in order to refine future implementations of the TNFD. So it is an ongoing process. It's going to be challenging in the beginning, but as you implement it, the TNFD with different rounds, it will become easier.
And does TNFD have any specific suggestions for companies when it comes to data collection and overcoming the challenges, or are they a bit silent on that?
So TNFD, in fact, it has an amazing toolbox that they have put together with different sources that companies can start using to evaluate these impacts and dependencies across the supply chain. And also, it refers to the SBTN methodology. SBTN, the Science-Based Studies for Nature, it is a methodology that is way advanced now. It has not been finalized, but there are a couple of tools that can be already be used by companies. Some of them are free of use, available on their website, and they can help to start doing that evaluation of the supply chain.
Thank you. And I'll give a question. I'll actually throw this to either of you. So whoever would like to respond. When you see companies evaluating or measuring their biodiversity impacts, do you see them starting? Is there any sort of starting point? Do they ever start as a product or as a site? Or do most companies just go for the whole company right at the start? Is there anything you're seeing as you're working with your clients?
We have seen both in terms of, I mean, there's companies that have their ambition very, very clear in terms how they want to address biodiversity, what is the level for example, data availability that they have, and we can start by that. So we have the company that wants to start with the whole operation, or the ones that wants to start small and keep scaling up. For example, at Salpol, what we like to do is start small in terms of if prioritize the site or the business unit or the region that has the most information available, and based on that, build the whole plan, and then start scaling up or moving it around across operation or across regions in order to have a full and embedded TNFD strategy and disclosure. But we have seen both of them. The idea is that we have to be very, very sure that the company is ready to embark in this type of commitment, if you can call it like that, in terms of availability of time, availability of data, and of course, the will to embed biodiversity into the overall sustainability strategy. But we have seen both, and the good thing is that we can start at both levels. So we are able to perform from a readiness stage where the company does not know how to move, or we can move when they have done materiality assessments or even a few things in steps 1 and 2. So yes.
And I can jump on it and add in to Santiago that this is a long journey. As Santiago said, that the company has to be committed to it. It's a long journey, and it's going to need support along the way, because you basically are doing a transformational change. You are including considerations that you have not included before in your daily operations.
And can we talk about just briefly the state of biodiversity targets right now? I know we touched on it briefly in the presentation, but tell me, if a company wanted to set targets, what are the options? What is in draft? What has been confirmed? And kind of what are the types of targets you can set? Is it a company-wide target? Could you set site targets? Talk to me about targets just a little bit.
So I will say that you cannot set appropriate targets if you don't have the data. So as Santiago was saying before, like if you have a very good data and very good understanding of your value chain on a specific product or a specific geography, then you can start considering setting targets. The targets that we would recommend, they are of course aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is for, let's say, the sister of the Paris Agreement, but in nature conservation and protection. So the Global Biodiversity Framework presents a challenging. We don't have one main goal, like against the Paris Agreement where we have one. But here with the Global Biodiversity Framework, we have 23 different goals. So one of the most important is to conserve 30% of land, water and ocean by 2030. And this is one of the commitments that we can see in companies implementing now, how or what is the approach they can take in order to be working towards that goal. But there are other goals, and that will depend absolutely in what are the main, I will say, drivers of the company, and also what they are ready to commit to.
Adding a little bit on top of what Diana just mentioned, the Global Biodiversity Framework has a very strong target, which is target 15, which is very much intended for companies and financial institutions to disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. This specific target 15 has driven most of the ambition from many companies around the world to actually start doing that assessment of impact and dependencies and adopting the TNFD framework as the framework to disclose this type of relation with nature. So as we move into the COP 16 will happen this year here in Colombia, and the idea is that we can check how those targets are moving, but specifically how the private sector is moving towards biodiversity or nature protection, adopting specifically frameworks that allow them to understand and act depending on their status on nature. Mm-hmm.
Thank you both. I want to ask one final question as we near the end here. You've both been working in this space for a long time. You work with a lot of large clients that are acting on this. I'm curious, when you look 5, 10 years out, and you think about biodiversity in the private sector, where do you think we'll be? Like, what do you think the status quo will be? You know, what are the trends you're seeing today, and how do you see them playing out over that time frame? Maybe Santiago, we can start with you.
Sure. There's as we mentioned, those corporate the drivers for corporate biodiversity action. There are a bunch of others that are pushing towards companies moving faster in terms of nature than what we did in climate, for example. Right now, for the biodiversity market, the outlook is pretty strong in terms of methodologies, certifications, and international agreements are in place and they are coming up to the market. The downside of the biodiversity market, for example, when we think about investments, biodiversity credits are still under discussion, even if there are methodologies everywhere and most of the companies are developing their own versions of biodiversity credits to drive investments. There's still a challenge in that specific area, but we are seeing specifically that most of the companies are moving towards adopting very early stages of how to understand the link with nature in their operations specifically. One of the things that we have seen that is
I think we lost Santiago, but I can fill in while he's coming back. So I totally relate with Santi's words. I think that we are going to see a major shift in the way companies operate by embedding these nature-related considerations into the daily operations. Also, we are also seeing how the financial institutions are a main drive into this shift. Because that is the ultimate goal, right? Like we are trying to divert those financial flows that create negative impact on biodiversity towards those companies through their activities that are creating positive impact. So we can see that all the pieces are falling now, and we are also seeing how they are shaping the future environment.
Thank you, Diana. It sounds like Santiago's back. Sounds like he lost power in the office there.
Hi, I'm back. I lost power at the office, but I'm sure Diana answered the question correctly at the end. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Well, hey, thank you both again. Santiago, Diana, you are both wealths of knowledge, as I said before, on this topic, and we really appreciate your time today. Thank you to everyone that attended. As a reminder, we will send out a recording to everyone. So if you have any colleagues or friends that couldn't make it today, or if you would just like to review this afterwards, you'll receive that recording. And if you have any questions, we have our socials and whatnot below on the beginning screens. You should have our emails. Feel free to reach out. We're always happy just to chat. If you have any follow-up questions as you think more about this. Thank you very much. We hope you have a great rest of your week and see you soon. Take care.